Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Your data is like gold to hackers, and they'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBTQ podcast. I'm Bryan Lowder, an editor at Slate, and this week we're going to take a bit of a step back from the endless flurry of Trump administration news and consider a broader view of how we got here. Specifically, we're going to look at how an anti-trans movement that just a year or two ago billed itself as being merely about, quote, protecting children, transformed so quickly into a far more ambitious and vicious one, attacking the lives of trans adults and trans youth alike. As we know, that Save the Kids branding strategy unfortunately worked on a lot of people, especially parents, across the political spectrum, and Trump's campaign invested in it to the tune of many millions of dollars in anti-trans political ads. Yet, on Trump's first day of office, it was passports and official gender markers that his State Department went after, and the project of limiting the scope of trans public life has only escalated from there. To help us understand this shift, or you might accurately call it a con job, I'll be joined today by journalist and friend of the show, Nico Lang, who's recently published a piece in Slate under the headline, "It Was Never About Protecting Kids." We're going to take a short break, but before we do, listeners, I just wanted to remind you that if there are any news stories, social media situations, or questions about this really scary moment that you would like to hear us cover, please contact us at outwardpodcast@slate.com. We want to know what's concerning you and what you need to know more about as we all navigate the coming months and years ahead. So again, you can always reach us at outwardpodcast@slate.com. And remember, to see all of Slate's coverage of this unfolding crisis, go to slate.com/tag/transgender. All right, we'll be back with Nico after a short break. Stay tuned.
Oh, Outward listeners, here's some scoop for you. So what is it, you ask? It's that Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. Now, before anyone goes suggesting this is just rumor, know that there's actual proof this kettle of tea is not only piping hot, but 100% true. So yeah, sometimes it pays to be a little nosy, but it always pays to discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Moms, tired of overthinking every decision around what's best for your kids? Stop. Get Smarty Pants vitamins and worry about one less thing. Smarty Pants Kids Multi and Omegas support kids' overall health with 16 daily nutrients, including vitamin C for immune support and D3 for bone health. That's 45% more nutrients than the leading kids' multi-gummy brand. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Get Smarty Pants on Amazon today.
All right, we are back. If you need a refresher, Nico Lang is an award-winning reporter, editor, essayist, author, and critic. They've written for Slate, Rolling Stone, Esquire, Teen Vogue, Them, The Advocate, Vice, The Wall Street Journal, Out, and many other places. And their Instagram is the indispensable Queer News Daily. They were last on the show to discuss their fantastic new book, American Teenager, which is a chronicle of trans youth living their lives in 7 states across the U.S. If you don't have a copy of that yet, you are behind. Please go pick one up. and check it out. Nico, welcome back to Outward. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I wish it were under good circumstances.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, that's been the way of the world the past couple of years, I feel like. But yeah, especially now. Speaking of the last couple of years, actually, I was hoping that as sort of setting up the conversation we're going to have, you could remind us what the rhetoric on the right, and even to some extent, I think like the center and center left, about trans people was like. My memory is that it started in this sort of quasi quote unquote, right, reasonable place where people were just asking questions about gender affirming care for minors, even though that has been medically, approved forever, fair sports participation, that kind of thing. And then it sort of escalated to this idea of protection that your piece is about, kids needing protection. And I know you read about how J.D. Vance in particular was really vocal about this, right? So can you just sort of set the scene of like what that rhetoric was like a couple of years ago leading up until the Trump election?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'd like to zoom back even a little bit further to like the 2016 HB2 era, because I think that's really instructive about what they're because I've been thinking a lot about the fact that for the uninitiated, HB2 was sort of like the first modern anti-trans bill and the first...
This is the North Carolina bathroom bill for people
Yes.
who, yeah.
In North Carolina, that restricted trans bathroom use across the state, also in private businesses, government buildings as well. It was for everybody, and it led to this huge backlash against the state, and also this public backlash of people, I think, wondering why this is something they were supposed to be concerned about. And at the time, it just felt like the messaging that the right was pushing, that trans people were a threat to you and they were a threat to your families and children, just wasn't sticking. And I think part of it is that the Republican right hadn't trained people to view the trans community as a threat yet, right? That education hadn't happened. So they had to lay the groundwork for that to sort of like get us up to speed. HB2, it passes. It fails in 2017 because it's repealed and replaced with a new law that then like sunsets in 2020. It's a whole thing. But they sort of go back to the drawing board, right? And they ask themselves, okay, that didn't work. How can we get at this subject, but in a new way? And what they did was they tried kids, right? They went for the anti-trans sports bills, restricting sports participation by gender identity. They are now doing the medical care bills. They started with kids and they are now moving to adults this year. And they've tried all these other things. And the real, I think, mission behind that and what I explore in the piece is that they were really trying to educate the public or like instruct the public that like trans people are scary. They're trying to convince people that like trans people are a threat to you. They're a threat to your rights. They're a threat to like women and children. And it's been a lot more effective. Like when they were able to use the kid issue as a Trojan horse to achieve the same thing that they were trying bathroom thing, it's worked in a way that like the bathroom bill in itself never did.
Yeah. And what's sort of, what's chilling about it, but also, I don't know what the right word is, sort of striking about it, I guess, is that this assumes that trans kids don't exist, right? Which children are we protecting, right? We're protecting cis children or normal, quote unquote, normal children, I guess they would say, from trans adults. But of course, there are trans children in the world. And so they're also having to do this strange mental gymnastics to basically say that they don't exist as they're doing the education that you're talking about.
Well, and it's not even just that trans kids don't exist. You had people like Lauren Boebert, who were just a few years ago pushing the idea that there are no queer kids at all. That under 18, you just can't know your sexuality that way. And again, that messaging didn't really seem to stick in that particular way of saying that there are no queer kids altogether.
Yeah.
But when it comes to trans kids, it's been a lot more effective. So you see them trying the same stuff, but they're using trans people as this wedge to get the bigger thing that they want. Because as, we talk about in the piece, people still don't know who trans folks are by and large.
Right.
I think that public visibility has really come a long way due to advocates like, like Laverne Cox, Elliot Page, and all of the really great work that they're doing. But if you look at statistics and numbers, the average person still doesn't know a trans person personally. They don't have someone who's trans or non-binary in their lives. So it's really easy to scaremonger in a way that you just can't do that with like gay and lesbian and bisexual people anymore. Data shows that for the most part, most people have at least one person in their life who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So like able to exploit fear in a way that you just can't do with like queer people in the way that we saw in like the Briggs Initiative, right? Or in the days of like Anita Bryant. People didn't know gay people then. Now they do.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about some of that history a little later. But just to keep us on this sort of timeline we're doing, we're in the sort of Trump campaign. This wedge issue is working, right? They really have figured it out, and they so much so that they invest millions and millions of dollars in these horrible, just gross political ads that are running, right up until the election. I remember $65 million in October, maybe it was a number.
It's way more than whatever we think.
In fact, it's not even just working. They believe it is like one of the winning issues for them, right? So what we'd expect maybe is then on day one of the presidency, we would have seen protection of children, like whatever that looks like, right? But that's actually not what happened first on that day. The first executive order we got was about something else. So can you talk about what that was and the impact it had?
Yeah. So the first thing they did is they went after passports, right? Is that the thing that got the most attention was that they were banning X passports, right? That if you're a non-binary person under the Trump administration, they will not give you an X gender marker on your passport, which is sort of like a gender neutral designation. As a non-binary person who has lost my passport and can't find it, that's been a real problem for me.
Yeah.
Now I can't get one. But I think what people have neglected to realize is it wasn't just about X passports. It was about corrected passports for everyone. That if trans person now, and you go to the State Department or the passport offices to get a corrected passport, they will not give it to you. They will give you a passport with your quote unquote original gender marker on it. And this also goes for people who have corrected passports. That if you, let's say you're a trans woman and you already have female on your passport, right? And you need to go get a new one, they will send you the document that you requested with an M on it. This has happened to people with like F markers, with X markers, with M markers. They're just like unilaterally denying people gender marker corrections. And I think people miss the real importance of this in that, like, obviously it is bad if trans people can't leave the country, right? If it's like a de facto travel ban for trans people, that is bad because a lot of trans people want to leave this country right now, and this might keep them doing so. Pro tip, you can always leave on a cruise. You can just like kind of do that and not come back. If one were looking to do that,
good
hypothetically, yeah, you can do that without a passport. But what it also does is it makes it harder for you to get corrected documentation in your own state. Because for the time I did this, it's a lot easier to get a corrected passport than it is other forms of documentation. It was really easy to get a corrected passport. You kind of just go and you do your thing and they just give it to you. And then with that, if you say live in Arkansas or place with the more restrictive policies when it comes to identification, then you can use that passport to say, oh, now you need to give me an ID, a state ID, a driver's license that reflects my gender, that reflects my name, because I've already got one from the federal government. And for the most part, they would acquiesce to that. And without that mechanism, without that document that you already have, it makes it a lot harder for you to like get the rest of your documents done. So for me, like that was such a big part of my process. Like I believe that I started with my passport and then I did everything else. Other folks who are looking to do the same thing, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And I was in New York already when I started that, already in a place where like getting your documentation is relatively easy as a trans or non-binary person. So I can only imagine if you live in a place like Florida, like what a headache this is for you now.
Yeah. What do you think it signaled at that moment about the administration's actual intentions? Like if we weren't actually here to protect the kids or save the kids, what does this sort of signify or suggest that they're actually interested in doing?
I know this is going to sound alarmist, but I also think a little alarmism right now is kind of justified in an order because of the scope of everything that they're doing. So I couch that by saying it does sound extreme, but I think that's merited. It's the all-out eradication of trans people. And not in the like, I know people hear that and they go like, oh, they're not rounding people up like the Holocaust, right? And they're not doing that. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the full-scale eradication of identity, right? That like, if you take away someone's legal identity at the federal level and at the state level, it is very, very, very hard for people to move about public life. It's very hard to get a job. It is very hard to get housing. It's very hard to get healthcare. It can be even difficult to access like a homeless shelter if you happen to find yourself unhoused. There are all of these specific barriers that are put in place for you really, really, really quickly. And you see Republicans right now trying to take away trans access to public life in a lot of different ways. There's a resurgence of bathroom bills all across the country right now. We even see in the chambers of the House of Representatives. Passed a bathroom ban there, restricting one of their trans colleagues from using the women's restroom.
And Nancy Mace is like policing it herself. Right?
I know. I don't even want to say that woman's name.
Yeah, I know.
Like, let's not give her any attention. That woman is good. But, you see them in all of these ways trying to make it more difficult for people to like go about their day. The administration just passed a bathroom ban affecting all federal agencies. So it's like, if you are a federal worker who happens to be trans, it's a lot harder for you to just go to work now. If you haven't been like laid off by their like DEI cuts, right? And what they're hoping to do then is make it impossible for trans people to leave their house or to exist in this country. Like, really what they want is they want people to move. They would love nothing more than every trans person who can to leave this country. And I'm not saying like taking any kind of position on that. I think everybody should do what they need to do. So if you need to get out, do that. If you want to stay, do that. But I think it is what it is. Like, this is like, they hope to create as much chaos and damage and fear as possible. And currently they're doing a pretty great job of it.
Let's take a quick break there. And when we come back, we're going to dig a little more into the policies that actually do affect trans youth and other youth, and then also some of the history that you were mentioning. All right, we'll be back in just a second.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Build a routine with Ollie that supports your wellness needs, like getting your daily vitamins and minerals with Ollie's multi-gummies, or keeping your mood upbeat with all the vitamin D in Hello Happy. Give your gut health some support with probiotics, and wake up feeling refreshed after taking Ollie Sleep. Do wellness on your terms. Find Ollie at a Walmart or Target near you, or at ollie.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
We are back with Nico Lang. We've been talking about sort of the fact that the administration started in this interesting way by attacking trans adults, really, or identification anyway, as a sort of an index of adulthood, maybe. But of course, they moved very quickly into also attacking trans youth, specifically in terms of gender-affirming care and that kind of thing. Can you just fill us in on where we are at the time of recording, because this will probably change by the time it comes out, at this moment with those specific orders and policies?
It's about 25 states that have passed their own laws banning gender-affirming care through either the legislative process, or some have done so through executive order, right, where they restrict things that way. But then on top of that, I think it was like day 3. Yeah, it was early, but not the first day, that Trump issued an executive order banning Medicare and Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care for kids. But then on top of that, and this is the really, pernicious thing for me, threatening to revoke funding from federally funded medical centers that treat trans youth patients. And that threat is a lot even wider in scope than the first, because, what that does is it makes hospitals like NYU Langone and Lurie Children's in Chicago, makes them scared to treat patients that they've been treating for their gender-affirming care needs for years. And a lot of those medical centers have had to put their treatments on pause for right now while they weigh what to do. And I know that there's been a lot of like protests against them for doing this, but I do have some sort of, not empathy is the right word, but I understand the difficulty of where they're basically sort of scrambling to figure out, okay, like we want to do the best thing for our patients, but how do we do that and not be defunded by the government? Like that's what Trump wanted to do. And they bragged about it. They literally put on their website a fact sheet bragging about all the hospitals that have said that they plan to temporarily discontinue gender affirming care. I mean, it just makes me so sad because so many kids who maybe thought that they lived in these safe bubbles, right? Maybe their like families move from unsafe states and they go to these states that are more progressive, but are a little more expensive. And they do so at great sacrifice to themselves and their families. You get there and, you live in Chicago now and your hospital still won't give you gender affirming care because of what Trump is doing. And it's really showing trans youth and their families that there's nowhere in this country that's really safe for them right now, not as long as Trump is president.
Yeah, that's completely heartbreaking. I mean, to have that, this forced migration basically, and then to have the rug completely pulled out from under you. I mean, it's unimaginable. Although we actually just interviewed Chase Strangio, and he did share a little bit of good news that I'll just put here, that at least at the time of that recording, a temporary hold had been put on the gender affirming care orders. And some of these institutions that you mentioned, I don't remember which ones exactly, but some of the hospitals have started, at least under that, 14-day pause, have started to do care again. So I think there is some hope that maybe they will, it's not gone forever, but we'll have to see, as that legal challenge plays out. So I wanted to take a moment to do a little bit of the history here. One of the things I love in your piece is that you trace this idea of sort of protecting the children or saving the children back many decades, and to one of my sort of favorite villains in queer history, Anita Bryant. So can you tell us a little bit about her and then sort of maybe take us forward? Where has this trope shown up?
Sure. And I will say that I'm not an Anita Bryant scholar, despite finding kind of fabulous, like in an evil, horrible way.
Yeah.
Like it makes me miss a time in which like I enjoyed hating Republicans more. Like I was complaining to my husband the other day that I was like, where's Michelle Bachmann gone? God, wasn't she so much fun to laugh at? Because I feel like these days, I just don't enjoy laughing at Republicans anymore. And the days of like Anita Bryant being like pied in the face and how much fun that was. Like, God, I miss that for us. I want that for us. But, this was really a time in which the public was fighting over the place of gays and lesbians and bisexuals to a lesser extent in society and what our sort of basic rights and protections were.
We're talking about the 1970s, right?
1970s, yes. Yeah. And what I was about to say is that, at the time, I think we forget that I believe a majority of states, it was still illegal to have gay sex, right? Those laws didn't really start to change until the 80s and 90s. And then you get the Lawrence versus Texas decision. But, at the time, what people were fighting about wasn't just like gay sex. It was also public accommodations. It was also the workplace. And things like the Briggs Initiative and then the Anita Bryant campaign, which is sort of popularly known as the Save Our Children campaign, was about whether it was legal to deny people employment based on who they are. And in this case, it was gay teachers in public schools. It was like gay public servants. And in those places, you sort of have a split decision, where in Florida, it was in the Miami-Dade County. That's how, yeah, right. Dade County. No, it's Dade County. They decided to repeal a non-discrimination ordinance that had banned anti-gay discrimination in employment. Basically, people went to the ballot box and they said, no, we want to be able to discriminate against like gay people. We think it should be legal to deny people employment based on who they are. And a lot of that was to do with Anita Bryant's efforts. Right. It was to do with her advocacy, because the fact that she was this Christian singer and this like nationwide celebrity, like her advocacy for that cause brought so much more attention to it. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the piece, but that the turnout for that vote in Dade County was record breaking. They've never had so many people turn out for a special election in that county's history. And I don't know if that stands to this day, but it might. And then with the Briggs Initiative in California, you had things go the opposite direction. It was a similar debate, that time specifically focusing on gay school teachers. And the Briggs Initiative failed. It was a sort of statewide ballot proposition in the way that Prop 8 years later. Prop 8 obviously went the opposite direction, the way that we didn't want. But with the Briggs Initiative, it was this really early critical like gay rights win to show that like the public would support LGBT rights at the ballot box. Because before then, I think it had always been viewed kind of passively as a political loser. But it showed that with the right messaging and the right advocacy, and also like, people like fighting really passionately for this, like we could win. And then you see, you know, echoes of that throughout the years, even in Alaska. In 2017, Kate Sawson, who's a really talented trans reporter, and I went up there because they had been debating whether to overturn their anti-trans non-discrimination ordinance. And they tried to do essentially a whole Briggs Initiative thing in Alaska. And in that case, they also failed. So you see once again where we learn that we have this political power at the ballot box if we can just mobilize it. But I think the thing that's really important here and that I wanted to stress is that it's the same debate that we're having today about the role of trans people in public life. Like, it's legal to deny people basic accommodations based on who they are, whether that's employment, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's healthcare, whether that's this or that. Like they used kids to get at that idea, right? That like we can scare people into discriminating against trans people. Same debate that we've been having for decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing we've talked on the show over the years about a lot is the sort of the power of summoning an anxiety about parental control. Like, you know, do I recognize my kid? Is my kid going to be different from me or different from what I imagine? There's anxiety around, is my kid going to be one of these people, or is one of these people going to attack my child, right? And so that is a very powerful thing, that the fact that we beat it, you know, in the Briggs Initiative and in other examples, like you mentioned, is pretty impressive, because I think it's a very strong thing. And I think, unfortunately, where we are right now is that it's sort of winning again has gotten us at least to this place where far broader attacks are being able to be made.
Yeah, and I just say that this is something I feel like I'm saying a lot recently, that it's the right diagnosis and the wrong solution. Because I think it's getting at this idea that like we forget it's really hard to be a parent. Right? It's hard to raise your kids. It's hard to do the right thing for them. It's hard to like raise them in this world that's like complicated and scary, and you don't always know if everything's going to turn out well for them. Like I helped raise my younger brothers because my dad wasn't always around. So I have some sort of insight into this that like, yeah, you want everything for your kids. And it's so like that kind of love is scary. It's like terrifying. But I don't think the solution to that is to keep kids from being trans and to scare the public about trans people. I don't think it fixes those anxieties. If anything, it just makes them worse.
Yeah, I think you're right. So one thing that you talk about in the piece is you sort of point out the dark irony that these policies that are sort of ostensibly about helping kids or protecting kids are actually going to make their lives harder, like in all kinds of ways. And we're not just talking about, you know, denying medical care. It's more things than that. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant there? And then I was also sort of relatedly also curious if you're hearing anything from the kids, probably now some of them adults, that you talk to for your book, because it seems like these things would be obviously very relevant to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a sort of prime example was something that I cut from the piece just sort of for like time and flow, which is the Benedict case. In that, you know, this is a kid who lived in Oklahoma, which is a state with an anti-trans bathroom bill on the books, who was attacked by 3 girls in a restroom at school and died the next day. There's a lot of debate about like the causes of Nex's death. Next used he and they pronouns. I'll use he for Next because that seemed to be what he used the most. But I think what remains true about his passing, like no matter the cause, is that anti-trans violence played a really key role in his death, and also so did anti-trans policy.
Yeah.
Things might have been different if he had the ability to access a public restroom at school that comports with his identity. And I feel like that's been really lost in the conversation. This also happened to a kid in Minnesota. I believe their name is Cobalt Sovereign. Sort of like, I believe non-binary, but maybe like trans feminine leading at the same time. I'm not totally sure. And they were attacked in a boys' bathroom at their school. They suffered a broken jaw. It took them like weeks to recover. It was a horrible, horrible situation. And here you have another situation where this student was technically using the bathroom that I believe Republicans would want them to use, the boys' bathroom, and experienced violence because of it. And this happens over and over again, that there's so much fear about what will happen if trans people use the restroom that aligns with their identity. And so many cis people aren't asking the question of like, what happens when they don't? And we know the answer to that. There are really high rates of harassment and violence. I believe the Williams Institute or the Center for American Progress study from several years ago that showed about 60% of trans people had been harassed or attacked in a public restroom, right? And those are people who use the bathroom that aligns with who they are. Those are people who did not. These are really vulnerable, often dangerous spaces for trans people. And Republicans have decided that the solution for that is to make them more deadly and dangerous. So, for lack of a softer way to put it, a lot of the kids from the book that I wrote, a lot of them are leaving if they are not currently making plans to do so. Others, it's sort of like on the short to long term horizon, that have fled their home states that were like redder to more progressive areas. This is like most of the kids in the book, if not all. Like there are very few kids that I feel very resolute in just like staying put where they are in a conservative place. Everybody's sort of scrambling for safety right now and trying to figure out like, how do I be like happy and healthy in an environment like this, in an environment that wants to like extinguish every bit of joy that I have? Because really that's what they're trying to do. You look at what's going on with the Stonewall Inn, where they erased all traces of trans people on the NPS website for Stonewall. And it's just to erase every bit of trans joy, to erase our history, to erase the entire lives of a community. So a lot of the kids that I'm working with are trying to figure out like what this all means now. Like, what does it mean to be trans in this environment? How do you be trans here? And a lot of them are deciding that they can't. And honestly, like, fair to them. I think that every trans person right now just needs to decide what like safety and dignity looks like for them. And if that means getting out, then honestly, good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're running up on time, so maybe a good place to sort of wrap things up would be a question that you sort of addressed at the end of your piece, which is, as we've been talking about, there's this long-running tactic or trope of protect the children, save the children. When do you think that tactic will stop being useful? It was very powerful against gays and lesbians at one point. It sort of, as we discussed, it sort of failed. Now it's being powerfully applied to trans people. Maybe it will fail there eventually, I hope. One of your sources sort of talks about this, so maybe you could quote them. But when do you see it stopping, or is it something we'll always be stuck with?
Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm so pessimistic these days.
It's okay. It's a dark time.
I'm like, maybe it will never stop, because maybe that's true. They'll just move on from one community to another, right?
Yeah.
That it's just like whack-a-mole, when like they can no longer strike this community with a mallet over and over again. There's another one that springs up that they decide that they can scaremonger over. Like, look at how long this was Muslims, for instance.
Yeah.
And like for like now, Republicans have just decided that they've expended their political capital on Muslims. So I feel like eventually Republicans will get to the point where they think the same thing about trans people, that they've sort of exhausted their resources there and they need to move on to something else. It's just going to, I think, a long time. Like, this has been really, really, really effective for them in a way that I think they hadn't always gained traction against other marginalized communities that they tried to exploit in the same way. It's really like paid off handsomely in a way that's terrifying. But I think, Devin Ojeda, who's one of the sources that I quote in the piece, we don't talk about it in the piece just for time, but they said to me what they think will be effective is when we start treating trans kids and all kids like people. Like people who have agency, who have control over their own decision-making process. There's this sort of idea of in loco parentis, where schools get to stand in for parents during the day that sort of get to be like the parent role, right? And it's essentially this idea that kids always need to be like watched and protected at every hour of the day, because what could possibly happen if they weren't just like safeguarded at every moment? And I think the more that like we empower kids in their own decision-making processes, and then we just like give them the right to sort of determine their own lives and identities and who they are, I think it will help like get us away from this like dynamic. I mean, that's so what my book was about. That I felt like when I was a kid, sort of, I think different from my queer identity, I felt like I had to fight so much for like a space for my own voice and like what I wanted. Because I had a family at the time that was really controlling and sort of like they decided what was best for me and sort of wouldn't listen to the idea that like I knew what I wanted and I knew what was best for me. And I felt for these kids in this book, I wanted to give them that. I wanted to listen to like, what do you want? Like, where is your agency here? And to give them as much space in their own life to like have that kind of like that direction, to be the one who gets to say where their life is going. Because I feel like kids in general don't always get that, let alone trans kids. Like from a really early age, it's like often you're like, parents decide what you're going to do. They decide like what school you're going to go to, what religion you're going to practice. And for kids, it's like, I wanted them to get a say in their own lives. And I think the more that we can do that for all kids to say that you get a say in who you are, you get a say in what happens to you, the more that we can stop panicking so much.
Yeah, I think that is so smart. And also, it's going to be, that's a very radical statement to some people, but I think it's one that we really need to all sort of meditate on and really try to take in, because that idea of sort of parental rights, parental control is so deep in our society. And I think you're right. That's been very damaging. I mean, you can see it, in everything we've been talking about today. All right. That is all the time we have for this conversation. There's so much more we could talk about. But listeners, if you haven't read the piece yet, the headline is "It Was Never About Protecting Kids." That's over in Slate. We've already mentioned the book, American Teenager. Please go buy the book if you haven't. Where else can people follow you, Nico?
On Queer News Daily, which is my Instagram handle.
Queer News Daily. Yep. Cannot recommend that enough. All right. Nico, thank you so much for writing the piece. And thank you for joining us on Outward. This was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right, that's it for the main show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed. This week, Nico will stick around to help us update the gay agenda. If you're not already a subscriber, remember that by joining Slate Plus, you get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on all of our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the Outward show page, or you can visit slate.com/outwardplus to get access wherever you listen. Otherwise, please send us feedback and topic ideas to outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show. Give us those 5 stars, please, so others can find it. Until next time, stay gay, everybody.